I think Mr. Gurdjieff understood human psychology very, very well. Much better than most of us do anyway. In his large work, Beelzebub's Tales to his Grandson, he lays down plenty of warnings about his own work. In the introduction, there's a piece about a guy who goes to market and sees, on his way to the market, sees the most delicious looking fruit and spends all his money on this large red fruit. And then when he tries to eat it, he finds that it's a large pepper and it's burning his mouth out. The moral of the story being that having purchased something, most of us will use it no matter what the cost. So this guy was eating this pepper despite all the pain and discomfort that it was causing him. Mr. Gurdjieff was warning people about his own work. It could be seen as a large red pepper, something to burn your mouth out. And then further in Beelzebub's Tales, Gurdjieff says, most people will believe any old rubbish. They don't use their reason. He's warning people. And yet, you still find people who will spend all their life reading and trying to understand Beelzebub's Tales. Now, I'm not the final arbiter on Beelzebub's Tales. Maybe there are people out there who can understand it. I haven't met any. And in fact, the people that I've known in the Gurdjieff work, and as I mentioned many times, some of these people were very, very close to Gurdjieff. They didn't even give Beelzebub's Tales time of day usually. It wasn't in their interest. In fact, one teacher actually said to me, Beelzebub's Tales was there just to keep the intellect happy while the real work could go on elsewhere. So it was there to satisfy people that effectively want to solve some kind of a puzzle and see life as some kind of puzzle. And I'm certainly guilty of that. So, with that kind of background, with not really knowing whether Beelzebub's Tales is something to be taken seriously or not, and I'll just add at this point, I had a conversation with this lady I mention very often who knew Gurdjieff, and I just said it seems to me like Beelzebub's Tales is one large Zen Koan. And if you don't know, Zen Koans are puzzles effectively that are given to students that they have to try and solve. So the famous one, what is the sound of one hand clapping? And these students meditate on these for years and possibly get something and possibly get nothing. But when I mentioned to this person who had known Gurdjieff and had lived with him and worked with him for many years, when I said, is Beelzebub's Tales just a large Zen Koan, she just looked at me and smiled, which was fairly typical of her actually. So she was either saying you're talking total bullshit or you might have something there. Either way, she didn't actually ever refer to it. It wasn't part of her work regime. So let me get back to Mr. Gurdjieff. He said a lot of things that people take very seriously. So the idea of self-remembering, for example. And certainly with people that I've known in the work, some of them walk around with a certain expression on their face. It was called the work face. By those who had a little bit more levity and could see what was going on. All these kind of zombie type creatures walking around with extremely serious expressions on their face, not even recognizing the presence of anybody else around them, were clearly deeply into self-remembering with this work face, which was the topic of much hilarity, I have to say. And one of the jokes that was told was, oh, he's going to walk into a lamppost because he's so busy self-remembering. So is self-remembering something you should pursue? Well, I've said in other videos that if it's a means to achieve a certain something else, then yes, but not in the way that is very often practiced. And Gurdjieff said things like, a man should be balanced in all three functions: emotions, intellect, and physical body. Have to say, I've never seen it. Physical people tend to remain physical. They're interested in sports and physical pleasures. Emotional people tend to remain emotional, maybe moody, angry, tempestuous, whatever. And intellectual people tend to remain intellectual, which is interested in concepts and ideas. And Gurdjieff introduced this idea of balanced development of man. And yet, there's a strange thing. The only thing that creates movement is imbalance. So, people tend to move towards something if they're in a state of imbalance. So, imbalance is actually a good thing. There's a very easy way to make yourself imbalanced, and that is to ask yourself a question. So if you ask yourself the question, what is the meaning of my life? You are immediately out of balance because you don't have an answer for that. Or, well, maybe you do, but most people don't. And in fact, it was once said to me that a question is life. It creates movement, has energy, and an answer is death. It stops that movement and stops that energy. So it seems that we are required to be out of balance to some extent to move forward. And so when Mr. Gurdjieff talks about the harmonious development of man and being in balance, having the three senses in balance, I sometimes wonder if the guy was just saying the opposite of what should really be the case, because, again, people that I knew who were very, very supposedly knowledgeable and experienced in the Gurdjieff work, they weren't balanced. They weren't even interested in being balanced. One of them was, a high intellectual. Another guy pumped iron all day. Well, not all day, but he pumped iron a lot. He ruined his body doing it, but that's what he did. And there was another guy who was an intellectual. And in actual fact, there were two guys who were fairly senior in one of the groups I was involved with. One who was essentially an intellectual, the other one was the guy who pumped iron. And they slag out each other off all day. Yeah, in a very, very good-mannered way. One would say to the other, what are you pumping this rotting bag of flesh of yours for every day? And the other one would say, well, what are you doing, masturbating over these ideas that mean nothing all day? And so, each can say to the other where the weakness is. But actually, if you're born one way, then it really doesn't, or really isn't a very good idea to try and modify that. Now, what happens if you do try and modify it? Well, you become neurotic. I've seen it many times. I've seen people who are essentially, let's say, intellectual in nature, trying to be he-men. Doesn't work. Or people who are intellectual trying to be emotional. Comes out as wooden and contrived. And yet if each was happy to be what they are, then they'd be really quite desirable people to be around. There are a whole bunch of practices in the Gurdjieff work which are, in my opinion, very, very dangerous. And one of the goals of developing harmoniously is one of those dangerous things. Was Einstein harmoniously developed? No, he had almost no interest in physical things at all. is the guy who can run 100 meters in less, or I don't know if it's less than 9 seconds, but the guy who currently holds the record for a 100 meter sprint, is he interested in relativity? No, I don't think so. He's fine-tuned his body. All the exceptional people in history were not in balance. Being in balance serves absolutely no purpose for that person or for the world. So you have to wonder whether Gurdjieff was just taking the piss. Some people, buy into it wholly. So, for example, with one group who had a certain contempt for intellectual types, I mean, it was quite palpable. The badge of honor was to shovel chicken shit. They had a farm, and the chicken shit all day, and if you could go in there and shovel all the chicken shit in 10 minutes, you were a hero, and you were awarded some badge of honor. And of course, they're just aping what Mr. Gurdjieff did. I've mentioned the book by Fritz Peters called Gurdjieff. And Fritz Peters was a young boy who grew up with Gurdjieff. Mr. Gurdjieff imposed some truly debilitating requirements on Fritz Peters. So go and mow that lawn. You've only got 3 hours to do it, or something like that. This poor child, who saw Mr. Gurdjieff as the only real authority figure in his life, felt that if he didn't do what Mr. Gurdjieff had asked, that he'd failed and that he was a failure. And Mr. Gurdjieff would then say, well, you can do it in an hour, do 3 lawns in an hour. So this poor kid would go and do this until he could do it. Anyway, the net result of all of this was that Fritz Peters, when he grew into a man, suffered multiple nervous breakdowns. So this sort of macho attitude in the Gurdjieff work is very, very harmful. And the reason I'm producing this is that I just hope that some people who are considering that they might go into the Gurdjieff work take some of these warnings to heart, because it's so easy to get carried away by being the chicken shit shoveling champion. Just meaningless, inane things that become very important once you're part of a group, or can become very important. I knew many people involved in the Gurdjieff work who were there mainly to try and become, I guess, what you would call important, to become superior, to be able to hurt people more effectively. Yeah, I'm not joking. I knew people who felt that by understanding how identification worked, for example, that they could then go out into the world, pull somebody in a little bit, then reject them hard and hurt them. These are the kind of... Don't for a minute think that the people who get into the Gurdjieff work are well-intentioned, good-hearted people, because in the main they're not. Many of them are just out-and-out egoists who are looking for some kind of power. They believe that the Gurdjieff work can deliver them some kind of power that gives them an advantage over the rest of humanity. It's gross and it's crass, but it's very common. So, hopefully that will... Well, I hope it will be useful for some people who are looking to get into the Gurdjieff work. Personally, I like the analysis done by M.G. Reedshaw. He has his channel on YouTube, and where he's allowed comments, he tends to get quite a lot of negative comments, which I personally think are totally unjustified, because the guy's just producing his own analysis and trying to say where he thinks the whole thing is flawed. I don't know if he's had any experience within various groups and had any sort of meaningful contact with the tradition, but some of his analysis is fairly good. It's a bit long-winded, but it's fairly good. So, do not buy into the Gurdjieff macho bullshit. It'll be very damaging for you and damaging for the people around you. And it can create monsters, and it can create mental instability. So be very, very careful.